So we are recording. So I will do a roll call in a second, but here is the agenda. So today we will talk about planning and environmental linkages, and we have HDR folks presenting that. And then a quick reminder on the Community Motion 2050 process, where we are, what we've done, what's coming up. And then Rachel Haukala will talk about the high capacity transit survey results. And I think this will tie very nicely to the earlier discussion that we've had on the PEL process and see where we can go with the high capacity transit options. And then Amy Luft will be reviewing with you the Compass Participation Plan draft for your feedback. And then we'll close up with some quick next steps. So with that, I will do a roll call, and if you would just say, indicate that you're here, and I will go with the RSVPs that I had. So Brent Ingram from Federal Highways. You're
yes, here.
I see you. Brent Moore, Ada County.
Here.
Good morning. David Draheim, BLM. Not yet. Carissa Nelson from LTAC. Maureen Gresham, Federal Highways.
Good morning.
Good morning. Tina Allayer from DEQ.
Present and dreaming of ham. Thank you.
Trevor Kessner from Boise.
Hey, everybody.
Good morning. And then I have Cameron Waite from HDR.
Good morning.
Good morning. Jason Longsdorf from HDR.
Yes, good morning.
And Claire Bowman from Nampa.
Here.
And let's see. I saw on the participant list, Ammon Wilhelm.
Yes, that's me. I'm here representing Brent Ralston from the BLM.
Excellent, thank you. And then I have some Compass staff, Matt Stahl.
Here.
Rachel Haukala. I thought, Rachel, you there?
Here.
There. Tony Teasdale.
Present, thank you.
And Amy Luft.
Here.
Okay, anybody I did not mention?
Ryan Head's here. I was just tardy, so you can mark me as tardy.
No, I won't. I'll just check that you're here. Thank you. Anybody else?
Rob McDonald.
This is
Rob McDonald, Caldwell. Thank you.
Yep.
Anne?
Corey Huggaboom from HDR.
Okay, great.
Jamie Kuntz from ITD.
Good morning, Jamie. Okay. Very good. So with that, then I will turn this over to Brent. I think you are going to do the introduction to the topic, and then we'll go from there.
Well, I
Brent Ingram?
guess I'll talk a little bit about the PEL process. And I'm pleased to see we have folks from HDR online, because they're really our hands-on experienced folks here. So I'll be pleased to hear from them shortly. But this is something pretty new to us in Idaho. The one line, Jason, Cameron, Corey have all been a part of that one Pell project experience area. But in past times, the way it would work or not work was that planners would go through a process of looking at some alternatives, maybe doing some alternatives or regional plan or something, some kind of an outcome from the planning process. And then as projects would come up, moving towards actual project development, in that phase of work, environmental folks would get involved and say, okay, we're going to look at some alternatives here. We're going to go out and talk to the public, and planners would go nuts and they'd say, we've already done that. We've talked to the public. We told them what we know what we're going to do. It's like, yeah, but you didn't do it in the right way that we can have a NEPA valid outcome here. We've got to go back and start over and develop some alternatives, evaluate them, talk to the public, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a real disconnect. And folks that have been around for a while have probably experienced that and lived through that madness. So Pell is a way of planning environmental linkage. It's the name kind of says it all there. It's a way we can work together early on, identify alternatives, bring in resource agencies, get their buy-in at the outset, talk to the public, and have an outcome that is NEPA compliant, such that it can be used as we move into that design, preliminary engineering phase of work. And you know, that's the basic concept. Like I say, it's fairly new to us in Idaho. It worked well in our one experience. We've got a couple more on tap that we think larger projects that we think this will be useful for. It seems like a good path forward, but it is something we're still kind of in the early learning stages. So I guess that's my overview, and I'll turn it back to other folks to elaborate further with more specifics.
Okay, great. So Cameron, you can take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Lisa and Brent. We're really excited to share this with you. We partnered with ITD District 6 on a Pell, and we'll get into the details of that a little later in this project, but I just wanted to give them that recognition that they saw the value in doing this. We started in the project 2017 and kicked off the Pell in 2018, working with Ryan Day as a PM and Karen Hyatt and Jason Minsker over in District 6, as well as Brent and Lisa Appleby at Federal Highways. And we had Horrocks as a partner as well, a sub-consultant with us that really helped us flesh out this process. The example one that we'll talk about, the I-15 US 20 connector. What we wanted to start with today is just kind of an overview of what Pells are and the benefit to, like Brent said, elaborate on what he shared. Jason, if you want to go to the next slide. Great, so this is, again, kind of our outline. What is a Pell? How does it differ from NEPA? How to determine if it's the right tool, and then we'll talk specifically about the I-15 US 20 connector Pell. So what is a Pell? It's a transportation planning study at a corridor or sub-area level that links the planning information, and I think this is key, directly or by reference into NEPA with Federal Highways involvement. So it'll identify transportation issues and priorities, environmental concerns, and will kick off and engage the public from the beginning on that and identify concerns. So how are they different than a what we've traditionally looked at as a feasibility or corridor study. One is, and an important one, is that they're adopted by federal highways. Again, being a partner in the process from the beginning in this planning study, that will allow us to focus and streamline the future NEPA project. Again, doing a lot of the alternatives analysis and screening up front before we're in the actual NEPA process helps coordinate the technical work and all those other things to get to the real feasible alternatives before we do a deep dive into the NEPA process. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jason to talk a little bit more about how it differs from.
Yeah, I can, thanks Cameron. I'll share a little bit about some of the specifics and give a couple of case studies here before we jump back into the details of the I-15 project. So the first thing is the trigger, you know, the decision to do a planning environmental linkages study. One important element is if you don't necessarily have your funding identified yet. Obviously, you know, if you're going to get a decision document on a new NEPA process, you've got to be fairly confident that you've got your funding for construction, you know, relatively secured. You're going to be able to prove that that's going to be fundable. PEL studies might be bigger corridors. You may not know where that funding's coming from, but you know that it's a project that you want to begin to develop. And so that is one of the things that is a reason maybe to start a PEL process as opposed to a NEPA process. You also may not have the solution very well defined yet. So those are some times when then the PEL really lets you kind of get your hands around a bigger problem to begin to dial down to figure it out. PELs are not a guarantee of any federal funding, and they don't reduce the level of NEPA analysis that's going to be required. I mean, if it's a major project, it's still probably going to be an EIS, but it does help streamline that process when you get there. In terms of study area, PEL projects can cover a very broad study area. That, you know, we in this case looked at 6 different interchanges. You know, at the beginning of the process, there was no telling whether or not the initial NEPA project might just be one interchange or one stretch of highway. But we knew that we had problems in this whole area, so we decided to kind of move back and take a really big picture look at that. Specific NEPA projects obviously have to follow all the regular NEPA protocols of having logical termini, independent projects that can move forward with independent utility. At the PEL level, you may not know that yet, but you know that this is your larger problem area, and you just want to start to figure out how to dial in on what the solutions should be. One case study for a US 85 in Colorado was an area where we helped with an 11-mile stretch of roadway to do the PEL study. And as we got into that, the county identified funding for a 2-mile stretch, which is that little orange piece on the map. And we were able to move those 2 projects concurrently. We were looking at a larger set of longer-term improvements over the 11-mile stretch, and we were aligning those with the near-term improvements that they had construction funding for that they were going to do NEPA. And so the NEPA process was looking specifically at those. But the nice thing about this one was, as we were looking at where you might eventually need even more right-of-way in that orange stretch, is that right-of-way, are you going to expand that right-of-way from the center line? Are you pushing everything to the east or everything to the west? And it helped the county set up in terms of longer term plans, if they did need additional improvements, that they wouldn't have to go back and repurchase an additional strip of right-of-way from people that they were already negotiating with. They were able to kind of streamline that, so they knew that where they would be going in the future to preserve that right-of-way. Purpose and need. PEL projects, obviously, as I said, identify kind of broader problems, and the purpose and need may, depending on what kind of solutions you come up with as you move into NEPA, you may need to make that purpose and need more specific. Like I said, for I-15, we were looking at 6 different interchanges on both I-15 and US 20. So that's a pretty broad stretch. I think as we move forward, our purpose and need ended up being pretty close, because I think we're going to tackle the whole project in this next phase. But oftentimes, if you're looking at 11, like the previous one, if you're looking at 11 miles, we obviously changed the purpose and need just for that smaller 2-mile stretch. That was the more urban stretch compared to the other 9 miles, which were a little more rural and probably have slightly different purpose and need. Criteria. There are a few examples here where the criteria may be more general in the PEL process as compared to NEPA. So some examples: safety, maybe you're just going to look at reducing conflict points, but you're not actually going to do a detailed crash modification analysis. Roadway capacity, maybe you're just kind of looking at total capacity, whereas in NEPA, you're obviously going to get down to the details of, intersection level of service. That's not to say that you can't do the more detailed work in the PEL process, but you do have some flexibility there. Multimodal operations, sometimes in PELs you just use up kind of a high, medium, low, as opposed to actually looking at, the exact dimension of what a sidewalk or a path is going to be, assessing a level of traffic stress or some other kind of more detailed modeling. So, and then when it comes to environmental resources, which I'll talk a little bit more, maybe in a PEL you're just documenting whether you're avoiding something or not, but you're not necessarily getting into details of what, exactly what is that mitigation going to be, who all needs to be involved. And there is one of the big differences is that the resource agencies are invited to participate. I would probably say encouraged to participate in the PEL, but there is no requirement that they participate or that they sign off on the particular findings of the PEL process. Alternatives analysis, the PEL study obviously is going to have some kind of evaluation criteria. You're definitely going to develop alternatives, a really broad range of alternatives. And you have the opportunity as a group and in coordination with FHWA to determine how many rounds of alternatives. Are you going to do 2 or 3 or 4? How reasonable are the alternatives? We use slightly different words as opposed to finding a preferred alternative with NEPA process. We look for recommended alternatives, and you're recommending things to move forward or recommending that they are not carried forward. Just like in NEPA, if you're going to actually eliminate something from the alternatives evaluation process, you have to have good, sound reasoning. And one of the lessons learned, having done several PEL studies, is that it is very important to document exactly why you're eliminating something, if you are, or even if you're just not recommending it to move forward. Because when you move into NEPA, you typically will have to kind of reassess the current situation. We've had quite tumultuous change in NEPA law over the last 4 years, and particularly in the last 4 months. And so documenting, if you're going to eliminate something because of, a certain, whatever the reason is, whether it's a regulatory reason or a travel conditions reason or land use reason, you need to document that so that when you start NEPA, if you say that one's off the table, we already cleared it, you need to be able to say that's still the case. That land use assumption is still the case. That travel model is still the case. Often the travel model will change just because it can take a couple of years to do a PEL process. And by the time you're starting up the NEPA process, the local MPO has a new traffic model. 2040 has become 2045 or 2045 has become 2050. And so that will need to be revisited if that's the case. So it's important to keep track of why it is you're eliminating or recommending an alternative. Another case study of Wadsworth Boulevard, which is just about a 2-mile arterial, urban arterial project. One of the things that was really successful was that during the PEL process, we were able to develop public support around a specific cross-section. And that really helped us secure funding in 2 ways. When they started the project, they had about $1 million for the PEL and nothing else. Based on the public support we developed and the excitement around the project, they were able to go to a local bond vote, and the public provided $7 million to contribute towards the project, which then acted as local match. And we were able to go to the MPO and secure a TIP grant for another 25 million, which provided the $32 million to actually get the project done. So had they just waited, they may have never had the funding to actually jump into NEPA. And now this project is about to go into construction. Environmental, I talked a little bit about the resources. I think the other point to make, a couple points to make on this are that you do want to be careful about the amount of effort you put into the environmental. You want to understand where the resources are, but it's likely once the resource agencies are required to be involved that they may want, more current information. So it's important to check in with those resource agencies. And if you're going to do a deep dive into any one resource, make sure that they're aware of it. And that's not going to be work that has to be done twice. Typically, the kind of loose guidance around PELs is that the analyses are good for 5 years. That is totally dependent on whether the resource agency is willing to accept that. So it's important to have that conversation with them, especially if you're going to spend a lot of energy doing the environmental analysis. The other point that I would make about environmental analysis is you don't have to look at everything. In NEPA, you're going to have whatever the 17 to 20 different categories that you are going to have to look at. In the Pell process, you can really pick the things that you think are going to affect the alternative that you choose. So in our case, for the I-15 US 20, 4F resources were really important. We know those were going to drive kind of the alignments that we were looking at. That was pretty critical. Probably the historic resources in the Section 106 process. We knew that was going to be important, so we spent a little extra energy on those. We did a little work, but spent almost no time talking about endangered species. We realized there were a couple that were probably not going to affect any of the different alternatives that we had, and we didn't spend any time. Spent almost no time looking at that. Air quality, we didn't do any modeling on air quality. We knew that we were going to be improving the situation no matter what we were going to do, and so that was really not an issue that we spent any time modeling or looking at. So it's important to kind of think through at the beginning, both with the Department of Transportation and whoever else the key folks are, to just focus on the things that might really drive your alternative from an environmental perspective. And although FHWA is involved in the process, you are inviting all the other resource agencies, or at least the relevant ones, the Pels don't make any legally binding agreements with those agencies. They can certainly push the conversation forward, have them really involved, make the NEPA process much more streamlined because they have seen the alternatives analysis that's happened before. But it is, it's a great head start, but it doesn't bind anyone moving forward. And level of design is also something that I will say, having worked on Pels in Minneapolis and Colorado and Idaho and Alaska, everybody does it a little differently, but the Pell guidance itself does not require a great level of detail. You can do a Pell process, and this example was from that US 85 project where we said we were going to potentially need interchanges. We just said these were 3 different possible types, and we didn't pick one. We said that's further down the road, that should be part of the NEPA process. We know they all generally have the same kind of a footprint, so the impacts are going to be similar, but you don't need to do the detailed design, and you'll probably end up revisiting that during NEPA anyway. Public involvement, as I mentioned before on the Wadsworth case study, is probably one of the best aspects of the Pell study in terms of being able to build public support, prove that folks have been involved, to truly take their input and use that as you're developing alternatives. And it can really make the next steps of the process much, much easier. And then what carries forward? So we talked about how this can be, Cameron mentioned how it can be adopted by reference. And it depends on your project, but the purpose and need statement, as we said, can, it will take almost no work for us as we start this next phase to revisit the purpose and need statement, because we were looking at essentially the same study area and solving the same problems. That environmental and transportation data, assuming, again, that conditions haven't changed by the time you start NEPA. Luckily here, we're starting NEPA within less than a year of finishing the PEL. If you have a 5-year gap, you're likely to have to revisit some of that. The public and resource agency input is pretty clear. In our particular case, we had some of the resource agencies write us letters for here's what we participated in, here are the specific issues we want you to revisit in NEPA, and it's going to be really, really clear where we start with them. The alternatives process, as Cameron will talk about, we looked at probably 20 significantly different, maybe I shouldn't use the word significant when we talk about NEPA, 20 substantially different types of alternatives. And we're able to narrow that down, and I think we're going to start this next process with just a couple of them. And then any other PEL documentation, all that public involvement work, any other agency coordination work, that can essentially be adopted by reference as you move forward. And rather than having to do probably a series of 8 to 10 rounds of public meetings moving into NEPA, we probably only need to do a couple now that the public really knows what the remaining couple alternatives are. So how do you know if a PEL is going to be the right tool? Really, if you want to shorten and simplify your NEPA process, you can develop a consistent corridor vision. And that can mean, like for us, if we had decided we were going to do a couple of the interchanges, but not all 6, we still may have had a pretty good sense that eventually once we got to the other 4, that these improvements would all work together. You can definitely, it's an opportunity to develop that agency buy-in and build stakeholder relationships, identify the major environmental concerns. As I pointed out before, not every single bit of minutia about the environmental process or environmental resources, but the major ones that are going to drive your alternatives. And it can help you eliminate alternatives that are really unmanageable, that you don't want to have to deal with at the NEPA level. It can also help set your project budget and establish a framework for requesting funding. Defines your project location and goals, the footprint, if there's implementation and phasing involved in the corridor that you're looking at, and it can identify discrete project elements for further study if you're going to break it into multiple pieces. So with that, Cameron, maybe we'll share the video real quick, and then we'll jump specifically into this. So for this project, we developed, let's see if I can find it, a video to kind of explain to, sorry, wrong screen. Okay, can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay, and did you hear the music start?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure. So this is a little video we put together to kind of introduce what the PEL process. So this is a rehash, maybe a little bit of what I've just shared with you, but just in a couple of minutes for what we shared with the public.
What is a Planning and Environmental Linkages Study, also known as a PEL? You may have heard of it, but what does it really mean? The Idaho Transportation Department is here to share with you information on the PEL process and how it benefits you and your community. PEL is a federally recognized process used to identify transportation issues, priorities, and environmental concerns. This proactive approach allows ITD to develop a vision for needed transportation improvements while being mindful of potential impacts on communities and the environment. By assessing these potential challenges and opportunities before they happen, ITD can work with stakeholders to develop more efficient solutions. As the PEL process develops an overall vision for transportation improvements, it also builds support from the community and other key stakeholders while providing a platform to discuss and prioritize transportation issues and project implementation. The PEL process creates documentation to streamline the next steps in project development while identifying potential funding strategies. The Pell approach can be flexible based on the goals and objectives of a project. However, there are 4 coordination points that happen with the Federal Highway Administration. First, ITD determines a reason for the Pell study and the desired outcome. This is where we will meet with FHWA to reach a consensus on the overall study goals. Next, we will assess existing conditions and gather data to define the purpose and need of the project while identifying secondary goals and objectives. Then comes the fun part, developing and evaluating possible alternatives while identifying environmental concerns and potential mitigation. In most cases, this step is where we need your feedback to assure the overall vision aligns with the community's needs. Finally, based on this evaluation and public feedback, ITD will prepare a final Pell study that captures the overall vision as well as immediate and long-term implementation strategies. So what's next? The Pell study provides a foundation for further refinement of specific projects during the National Environmental Policy Act process, also known as NEPA. The Pell provides context to issues of concern and avoids unnecessary effort analyzing less important issues. NEPA determines the final project alternative and addresses all regulatory requirements. As you can see, the Pell process provides a solid foundation for NEPA.
So there's our happy little sing-songy way of describing it. So I think now, Cameron, I'll turn it over to you to talk through how we applied it to this process.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Yeah, to go along with what Jason said, we did have a more robust public involvement process than maybe always needed on a Pell, but this I-15 and US 20 go right through downtown, or right adjacent to downtown Idaho Falls, and you can see we have exit 118 on I-15 through exit 310 on US 20. We have 5 interchanges in a little over a mile, and there's some huge congestion issues, especially exit 118 and 119 on Interstate 15 there right in town, that you'll have backup from exit 119, folks trying to get on US 20 that will back through the other exit. And the other interchanges, again, so short, there's severe congestion issues, weaving safety issues, and on and off ramps that are really substandard for that. So again, those were a lot of the things that led ITD to move forward with this. We did have a community working group, and we had our stakeholders, including the City of Idaho Falls and Bonneville County and the Bonneville Metropolitan Planning Organization were key partners in helping us develop purpose and need, alternatives, screening, as well as in the community working group. We also had emergency services, INL representatives, businesses and stakeholders from the area. So from meeting with those folks, looking at existing conditions and other things, we came up with the purpose and need. And as Jason said, it was refined through the process as we looked at different alternatives, but specifically look at those improvements to address safety, congestion, mobility, and travel time reliability on I-15 and US 20 in that area. And we expanded a little bit. Originally we looked at just those interchanges in town, but some of our alternatives moved routes and alignments outside of that core area. So we did expand that purpose need a little bit. And to address those needs that we talked about, as well as pedestrian and bicycle mobility. There's a big community there that is interested in that, and I-15 US 20, as well as the Snake River and the railroad that are all right there, are big barriers to the multimodal connections. And then we had some other goals, and I won't go through all those, but specific to how to support the community, interact with the community, and provide improvements that would, again, help with multimodal concerns as well as other key stakeholder concerns and issues. And so we started at level 1, and again, it was marked Sharpie lines on aerial maps, and we spent a couple days brainstorming again with ITD, the city, Bonneville County, MPO, and others. And you can see several different ideas here, as well as those that we advanced from level 1, again, Sharpie lines on a page, to level 2, a little more refined. If we go to the next one, those we started on alignment, again, on 15 US 20, I apologize. these four, and then we moved to others that were off alignment, meaning new I-15 and US 20 alignments for connections. And again, some had fatal flaws that didn't meet purpose and need, and other things that we were able to not recommend for those advanced. In level 2, we got quite a bit more detailed with layouts and alternatives, and looked at, you can see the names get more specific: Anderson Street, 33rd and Iona, 65th, looking at different locations and alignments. So if we can move to the next one, Jason. I think at level 2, we had about 14 alternatives. And again, through the public process and the Pell process, we were able to reduce those. This is alternative C, and you can see it's kind of a quasi on alignment. I-15 travels north and south, and then US 20 travels to the northeast. And you can see we looked at shifting the current exit 119 up closer to the airport, getting a new crossing of the Snake River, updating other interchanges that connect there, and new connections to try and get more separation between interchanges. And then in addition, we had added a third level of some direct ramps from I-15 to US 20 and back. The other alternative, this is alternative E1, very similar, but you can see the extents of those direct ramps and interchange connections extended further northeast along US 20. And then alternative H was one of those off alignment that created a whole new alignment of US 20 north of INL campus there and connected to I-15 north of the airport, which had some benefits and drawbacks, as you can imagine, compared to the in-town or on alignment alternative. But we still had to address things at exit 118 and 119, and a possible solution is what we call a split diamond, where we combine the two interchanges into one functioning interchange with collector distributor roads to reduce that congestion and safety concern on the interstate. Going through these processes, we looked at, and you can see different levels of line works. This was from level 2, where we just kind of showed different lines with colors that showed interstate, US 20, direct ramps, interchanges. As we got through level 3, we worked through 4 different public meetings, as well as several stakeholder meetings and community working group meetings, to come down to our final 2 alternatives that we recommend to move into the NEPA study along with the no build. Alternative E, go to the next one. Or is it the next one? Yeah, alternative E, again, is kind of the on alignment in town alternative with some direct ramps and improvements to existing facilities. And then alternative H, again, moves US 20 connection I-15 north of the downtown area through a little bit more rural area and connection there with some improvements still in town. We wrapped up this Pell study this past winter, and as Jason said, we're just kicking off the NEPA process to look at these 2 alternatives with no build to compare them. Let's see, let's go to the next slide. So the next step, one of the things that came out of it is this exit 119, this northbound off-ramp, is really the linchpin when folks are going to Yellowstone or BYU Idaho has a graduation. This just really becomes a bottleneck and backs up on the freeway. And so Clorox and ITD came up with this alternative to add dual right turn lanes and some other improvements for PEDs to cross under the ramp versus through the signalized intersection, to improve operations as kind of a Band-Aid or a short-term solution until the final alternative for the whole system is in place. And if you go to the next slide, as you said, the next funded phase is we're just starting on pre-NEPA activities, working to get NEPA clearance in the next 2 to 2.5 years, and getting 30% design of a preferred alternative. And then ITD is working, again, phase 3 with funding and other issues, get into final design, and then phase 4 right away. And let's see, go to the next slide. I guess, yeah, that kind of wraps up our presentation. I know it was a lot to digest and take in. I think there were potentially some questions that came in on the chat, but I'd like to open it up for any questions that anyone may have.
Thank you, Cameron and Jason. As you're thinking about your questions, there is a question in the chat What happens if you have a change in political power and hypothetically the new administration does not want to do something that was previously done through Pell?
It's a good question and probably likely. You know, like I mentioned before, there's nothing about the Pell that is necessarily binding. So if there is a total change politically, that can, you know, I'm sure that could totally change the project. I think what the kind of the purpose of the Pell is to build more, okay, it's not necessarily grassroots support, but a kind of an understanding of the project so that it's so that you're less likely to have that kind of a shift. But there certainly are times when, you know, if there is a political authority somewhere that's going to be able to oversee funding, could turn that around. I have not seen that in the Pell processes that I've worked on. I have seen it before during the NEPA phase for, you know, especially big transit projects that all of a sudden are out of favor. But I have not seen that. I'm not saying that Pell is a perfect way to avoid that. I don't think that it's necessarily that kind of a tool, but it certainly could happen.
And you know, that could happen just in the course of the NEPA development too. So it's just one of those situations you've got to deal with, whether you're doing Pell or conventional approach there. So one thing, and Jason alluded to some of this, Cameron as well, in their discussion, but there's not a lot of regulation around Pell, which gives it some flexibility, but it also means, you know, it's not really defined on what the milestones are or how you get to an endpoint or what that endpoint might be. So like I say, the good side is that gives some flexibility, but there's nothing to really look at to say, this must be this way.
Yeah, I guess I can give one more example. We've been working on a Pell for about a 10-mile stretch of urban expressway in Colorado, and we have been looking at the 2045 horizon year and coming up with improvements. We had a change of governor and a new leader for the Colorado DOT, who are very, very focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And although we've developed a pretty big range of possible improvements, they said to our project team that they want us to only focus on projects that will improve safety and reduce bottlenecks, but nothing that adds capacity in terms of, and only things that could be done in the next 10 years. So we have a big list, and we've had to adjust, to Brent's point, this flexible process to say, all right, here are all the things that are big picture ideas, and we're going to put them over here and not study them any further. And we're going to pull these things that could all probably be done in the next 10 years and are just safety and bottleneck reduction projects. And those are the things that we're going to detail a little bit more and take to the public. And that was halfway through the project, halfway through the Pell project. And our choice was either to do that or to just mothball the study altogether. Thankfully, we had several, to Cameron's point, just like this I-15, we had several local municipalities who had kicked in funding to help fund the Pell process. And it was going to be really politically uncomfortable to just mothball the project. So we shifted about halfway through. And we're like, great, we're just going to focus on things that can be done in 10 years. So that's kind of an example of how one benefit of a Pell process, you know, if it was a NEPA process, I think you would be forced to look at your horizon year and what are the projects that solve your level of service issues that far out. Since it's a Pell project, we could just kind of change halfway through.
Okay. Any other questions from local agencies,
I guess I would throw in also recent changes to, directives on how we do the NEPA process, which are now codified in regulations, but there are requirements for the higher class of action, NEPA class of actions, EAs and EISs. There are regulatory timelines that have to be met. 1 year for an EIS and 2 years for, 2 years for an EIS, 1 year for an EA. So that's pretty challenging. Those are our largest, most complex projects, most controversial, and they're saying, get that done fast. So some of these are challenging projects that have been kicked around by, sort of in a semi-public venue, in and out the public's eye. And, there's a lot of public interest in these things that we used to be able to take the time to work through. And we have good and bad examples of that. But now we're mandated to do those in that 1 or 2 year time frame. How do we get these challenging projects done in that time frame? So I think the Pell process is a great tool that allows us to do that before we actually kick off the formal NEPA process. We've already public about it, gotten the input from the resource agencies on what may or may not be viable from their standpoint, their particular resources. So I think Pell has a lot to offer on those larger, more complex projects.
Great. Corey, did you have something? I noticed you unmuted.
Oh, no.
Okay.
No, sorry. I have the mute on my phone, so.
Oh, that's okay. Well, unless there's anything, and if you do have some other thoughts that come to mind, please contact me and I can forward them on and follow up with folks. Thank you again to Cameron and Jason for your presentation. I really appreciate that. I think this is really good information for this particular group now and at this time. So again, thank you.